On this particular walk to Pennard, Mr. Evans realized that there were moments when his strange companion gathered up into her uncomely face a spiritual grandeur that was astonishing. Cordelia's face lent itself to windy and rainy weather. She had been herself a little shocked as well as startled by the manner in which, in that twilight escape by herself 7 months before, to the Two Oaks, she had been obsessed by a feeling of dominating power. Look at all those subordinate clauses. There's like 4 in there. It was about 4 o'clock on this early darkening December day when their field path, a very small unfrequented cattle drove on the way to West Pennard, led them past a solitary Scotch fir. The rough reddish-brown trunk of this great tree was soaked with the rain on its western side, and showers of raindrops fell on their heads from a big branch above them, which stretched towards the west like a gigantic extended arm. Excuse me for a second, I got the baseball game on. It's driving me nuts. Something about an extended arm. Cordelia wore an old cloth cap of Mr. Evans's, and he himself had come out bareheaded, fearful of not being able to keep on his head that gusty afternoon his familiar bowler hat. Thus, as they paused beneath the tree, whose upper branches groaned and creaked to greet them, the man found he could kiss the wet cheeks and cold mouth of his woman without the teasing interruption of either of their hats being knocked off, a thing that was always happening with these two clumsy ones. "I never knew what it was like to kiss," said Mr. Evans, "before I had you. I like kissing you at the end of a dark day and under the Scotch fir." Their wet, cold faces, her shapeless nose and his grotesque hooked nose like a caricature mask of a Roman soldier, their large, contorted, abnormal mouths, made, it might seem, more for an anguished curses against God than for the sweet usage of lovers, were now pressed savagely against each other, and, as they kissed, queer sounds came from both of their throats that were answered by the groanings of the tree and by the raindrops as the wind shook it. Diagram that sentence. A series of long-drawn cawings reached them now, as 4 black rooks with a faint grinding and grating of their huge wings passed over the tree, aiming for the rookery above Hartmore Court. Down somewhere in the southern edge of the field, where this Scotch fir grew, an old holly tree was creaking lamentably in the wind. Uninitiated travelers in that lonely spot would have casually remarked, "What's that creaking over there in that hedge?" But each of these 2 ugly skulls, with the anguished distinction of the ancient house of Rise upon the lineaments, thought with themselves, "How lucky I am to be happy when God delights to make even trees suffer." It's weird. As a matter of fact, although neither of these human lovers were aware of this, between that Scotch fir and the ancient holly, there had existed for 100 years a strange attraction. Night by night, since the days when the author of Faust lay dying in Weimar, and those 2 embryoed trees were in danger of being eaten by grubs, they had loved each other. The magnetic disturbance of the atmosphere at that spot, while the distorted mouth of Mr. Evans was pressed against the distorted mouth of Cordelia, was an agitation to the old tree in the hedge, so that in its creaking there arose that plaintive yearning of the vegetable world which comes to us more starkly in the winter than in the summer. In the summer, when the wind stirs the trees, there is that rushing, swelling sound of masses of heavy foliage, a sound that drowns in its full blossom, undulating, ocean-like murmur the individual sorrows of trees. But across the leafless, unfrequented field, these two evergreens could lift to each other their subhuman voices and cry their ancient vegetation cry, clear and strong. That cry which always seems to come from some underworld of being, where tragedy is mitigated by a strange, undying acceptance beyond the comprehension of the troubled hearts of men and women. It is on such gusty, early December afternoons, when darkness falls before people prepare for tea, that the symbolic essence of rain is most deeply felt, and that they should be realized in their essential quiddity. These whirling gusts of gray rain toss obliquely across the darkening hills. They must not come in a steady tropic downpour. Floods of rain destroy the quality and the significance of rain. Okay. Drops they must be, many, many drops. An infinity of drops, if you will, but still numberless separate drops, gray or brown or whitish gray, in order that they may retain that rain smell, rain taste, rain secret, which separates rain from ordinary water. They were both silent for a space after this embrace, standing under the Scotch fir. I think he's talking about the humans now, not the trees. And Mr. Evans thought to himself that the look he now caught upon her profile was one of the strangest and most arresting he had ever seen on a human face. And it was no wonder he felt like this, for her face had caught that mysterious secret of the rain, which very few faces and very few imaginations are able to catch. For Cordelia's face had caught it today, and it held it there now in all its wild, far horizon meanings. There are faces made for moonlight. There are faces created to respond to the wind. There are faces for sandy deserts, for lonely seashores, for solitary headlands, for misty dawns, for frosty midnights. Cordelia's face was made for rain. It had nothing in it that was normally beautiful. And yet it became, at this moment, the living incarnation of all those long hours when rain has mingled with her secretest hopes. Her face was charged with the rain that had streamed down the window panes at Cardiff Villa, twilight after twilight, while her thoughts had been flying far away, far over dripping forests, far over swollen rivers to green black castle walls, of which she fancied herself the mistress or the captive. The path they were following now approached a steep incline, which led between bare, muddy banks and along deeply indented cart ruts to a small clump of spruce firs at the top of a considerably high hill. They were both familiar with this hill and with this clump of spruce firs. There was indeed for Mr. Evans a special interest in this place, which was some distance out of Glastonbury. He had himself found a deserted sheepfold up there, in a clearing in the center of this little fir wood, a rough building made entirely of ancient blocks of mossy stone, but quite roofless and windowless. Pottering about evening after evening in the environs of Glastonbury, Mr. Evans and Cordelia had made more than one interesting find. But with regard to these old stones, they had been thrown so crudely together, here to form a shelter for sheep. Our Welshman had a theory that made them the most interesting of all his discoveries. He held very strongly to the opinion, and he had even persuaded Mr. Murray to come round to his view, that these stones originally belonged to the little Chancery, or hermitage, to which Lancelot du Lac retired to die after the vanishing of Arthur, and after Guinevere's retreat to the nunnery at Amesbury. It was a long, tedious ascent up to this little fir clump, nor had the place any striking aspect or any particular beauty save this ruined sheepfold in the center of it. And yet as they struggled up the bare slope in the rain, Mr. Evans remarked to his bride, Haven't you noticed, Cordy, that it's often some small, insignificant place like this that comes back to your mind with a sudden significance, rather than the more famous spots? She was not yet so used to be calling Cordy by Mr. Evans that it did not strike her as queer to hear it now as they made their way up this nameless and rain-swept eminence. Names are like clothes to girls. The name Cordelia, especially, when uttered by her father, always made her feel as if she was wearing her old, weather-worn, tailor-made costume, and beneath it her winter underwear against her skin. Whereas when she heard Mr. Evans call her Cordy, she felt as if she was wearing her thinnest cotton drawers. Since she had been married, she had been Cordy almost constantly in spite of the fact that she was now wearing her winter clothes. Like a tree that had begun to gather moss and lichen before it was old, there is so much untouched soil in the rich levels of this girl's nature that the green sprouts of passion grew more lavish and luxuriant every day. Between the Glastonbury trees, stripping themselves bare, and this Glastonbury native, stripping herself day by day of new maidenly reserves for the enchantment of her lover, there was a similar parallel. It was to the west wind that the Glastonbury foliage yielded and fell, and it was to the gusty intermittent motions of Mr. Evans' erratic desires that Cordy's innate chastity sank away. Not one aspect of her life under those new brick tiles of her little house, fresh from the local brickyard to the north of Bove Town, where the council had brought them, but became associated with her gradual seduction. The fact that the Welshman cared little for womanly beauty, the fact that behind the concentration of his desires was nothing but the diffused sublimation of his suppressed vice, render this girl's initiation into the nervous excitements of Eros an arena of hidden rapture such as, at that epoch, contained no equal within the purlieus of the whole town. The two descendants of the House of Rise were now halfway up the ascent of their hill, their boots and stockings already thoroughly soaked by the wet stalks of the dead bracken. The slope they were ascending was to the northward of West Pennard, whose outskirts, in following their winding cattle path, they had already passed. Between the summit of this hill, topped by the clump of dwarf spruce firs and by the ruined sheepfold, and the banks of White Lake River, there was nothing but the rough tract of untilled country known as Hartmore. It was thus an unfrequented a spot as could be found within the few miles of Glastonbury, and had a circle been drawn about that town, no point upon its circumference, save perhaps Crannel Moor to the west of Godney, would have been secure against human invasion. Save for an occasional shepherd boy, guarding a flock of black-faced ewes from Norwood Farm, no one, even in summer, ever came to this place. Thus, when Mr. Evans suddenly cried out, "There's a light in the sheepfold, Cordy," his voice was as startled as if he had informed her of the presence of a gibbet up there with a figure swinging from it. A steadily burning light, when you are convinced of being several miles from any human habitation, is a thing that naturally makes a person's pulse beat. "It is the Northwood shepherd?" panted Cordelia, trying to keep pace with her companion's long strides. "Hush!" was Mr. Evans's reply as he quickened his pace still more. She followed him in silence, and together they pressed forward, ascending the hill. The wind struck them with such force as they climbed, and the darkness had gathered about them there so suddenly that Cordelia began to experience that natural human nervousness which the approach to a flickering light in a lonely spot can induce even in one not usually subject to common timidities. She whispered something in her companion's ear that the wind rendered inaudible. Well, I wonder who they're going to meet. Perhaps part of this so-called conspiracy, as this chapter is called. By the way, what time are we in now? Because the last chapter was in December, but I feel like they're talking about November now. So is this going back in time? Is is this like an entire year later? I don't know. Maybe somebody could say in the comments what it is. Anyway, till next time, I'll see you in Glastonbury. Cheers.